Ryan Mitchell had a system for packing, one he'd refined over 8 years of monthly business trips until it took him exactly 11 minutes, start to finish, the black roller bag laid open on the bed, 3 days of shirts folded the way his mother had taught him, the leather dub kit zipped and dropped into the side pocket, the boarding pass already saved to his phone before he'd so much as touched a sock. He was good at leaving. It was one of the strange, specific skills a decade in medical device sales had given him, along with an encyclopedic knowledge of Southwest's boarding groups and a stomach that no longer noticed turbulence. "You're doing the thing again," Emily said from the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between fondness and the tiredness that had been creeping into her voice more often lately, though Ryan, half his mind already on Tuesday's presentation to the regional buyers in Columbus, didn't clock it as anything more than the ordinary fatigue of a Sunday evening. "What thing?" "The 11-minute thing. You've got a system for everything. I bet you could pack blindfolded." "I could," Ryan said, folding a shirt with a small flourish, "pack blindfolded, upside down, and while reciting the Gettysburg Address." Emily laughed, and it was a real laugh, and for a moment the tiredness in her face lifted, and Ryan thought, the way he often thought in these small, unremarkable domestic moments, that he had built a genuinely good life, a wife he still found funny after 9 years of marriage, a house in a quiet Charlotte neighborhood, with good schools nearby for whenever they got around to having kids, a career that paid well enough that Emily could work part-time doing the design consulting she loved, rather than a job she merely tolerated. It was a good life. He believed that completely, zipping his suitcase shut, and he had no reason yet to believe otherwise. 4 days this time, Emily asked. 4 days. Columbus Monday and Tuesday, then up to Cleveland for the Wednesday client dinner, back Thursday night. Ryan set the suitcase upright by the bedroom door, the same spot it always went, a small domestic ritual neither of them had ever named, but both of them recognized. "You'll survive without me." "Barely," Emily said, and kissed him, and the kiss was warm and familiar, and gave Ryan absolutely no indication of anything unusual, because that was, Ryan would come to understand much later, the specific horror of what was actually happening in his marriage, that Emily was extraordinarily good at this, had gotten better at it with practice, the practice of 9 years, and, though he did not know this yet, would not know it for a long time, the practice of roughly 24 business trips during which she had not, in fact, spent a single one of them the way he imagined she had. He left Monday morning at 5:40, an Uber idling in the driveway in the gray pre-dawn dark, and Emily walked him to the door in her robe, sleepy and warm, and told him to text her when he landed, the way she always did, and Ryan climbed into the car and watched his own house recede in the side mirror, no idea at all that the moment the Uber's taillights disappeared around the corner, his wife would go back inside, make a pot of coffee, and 3 hours later walk the 11 steps across the shared side yard to Jason Brooks's back door. Jason Brooks had moved in next door 2 years earlier, a contractor in his late 30s, recently divorced himself, the kind of easy, handy, perpetually in a t-shirt neighbor who fixed his own gutters, and always seemed to be around on weekday afternoons, in a way that at the time had struck both Ryan and Emily as simply the schedule of a man who worked for himself. He'd helped Ryan rebuild the back deck one long Saturday, the two of them drinking beer and talking about nothing in particular, and Ryan had liked him, an easy, uncomplicated liking, the kind you extend to a decent neighbor without examining it too closely. He had no idea, that Monday morning, or for a long time afterward, that the friendliness between his wife and his neighbor had, over the better part of 2 years, become something considerably less neighborly, that it had started, in fact, almost exactly the way these things tend to start, with borrowed sugar and small favors and an ordinary kind of daytime loneliness that Emily had never quite found the words to explain to her husband, because her husband was very rarely home to explain it to. To understand how it started, you had to go back nearly 2 years, to a Tuesday afternoon in October when Emily Mitchell stood in her driveway staring in frustration at a garbage disposal she had just successfully flooded her kitchen with, Ryan 3 states away in Nashville for a trade show, and Jason Brooks pulling into his own driveway at exactly the wrong, or exactly the right, moment to see her standing there in rubber gloves, looking like she was about to cry. "Rough day?" he'd asked, setting down his toolbox. "You have no idea," Emily said, and laughed despite herself. And within 20 minutes, Jason had the disposal fixed and refused any payment beyond a beer from her fridge. And they'd sat on her back porch for an hour, talking about nothing: his recent divorce, her design work, the particular strangeness of a marriage built around a husband who was gone 1 week in 4. It was, in that first conversation, entirely innocent. Emily would have told you so with complete honesty, and it would have been true. Jason was easy company, funny in a low-key, self-deprecating way, and there was something restful about talking to a man who had absolutely no agenda beyond killing an afternoon, no expectations, no needs she had to manage. She went inside that evening, made herself dinner, and thought nothing more of it, beyond the mild, pleasant afterglow of having had a nice, unexpected conversation with a neighbor. But afternoons like that one kept happening, the way things keep happening when two people live 11 steps apart, and one of them works from home and the other spends a third of every month with an empty house and no one to talk to. By December, Emily and Jason had a standing, unspoken rhythm. Most days that Ryan traveled, at some point in the afternoon, Jason would knock on her door, or she'd wander over to his, and they'd end up on one porch or the other with coffee, then eventually wine, talking about everything and nothing. And Emily found herself, without quite tracking the moment it happened, looking forward to Ryan's trips in a way she hadn't looked forward to them before. Not because she wanted Ryan gone, she told herself, but because Jason's company had become, quietly, one of the good parts of her week. The first time they slept together was in February, 14 months before that Monday morning Uber ride. On a night Ryan was in Atlanta for a 3-day conference. It happened, Emily would later tell herself, in the specific self-exculpatory language people use for things they know were choices dressed up as accidents, almost without either of them deciding it. A bottle of wine, a movie neither of them was really watching, a hand on a knee that neither of them moved away. And then it simply happened, the way water finds the lowest point in a yard without anyone digging the channel for it. She cried afterward, that first time, real tears, genuinely frightened by what she'd done, and what it meant about the kind of person she apparently was. She told herself, getting dressed in Jason's bedroom with the streetlight coming through the blinds, that it had been a one-time thing, a mistake born of loneliness and wine and bad judgment, that she would end it immediately and never tell a living soul, and Ryan would never need to know because it would never happen again. It happened again 3 weeks later on Ryan's next trip, and one after that, and one after that, until, this was the part Emily would spend years afterward trying and failing to fully explain, even to herself, it had become, without either of them ever discussing it as such, simply what happened during Ryan's business trips. Not every single day he was gone, not at first, but reliably, predictably, almost ritually. Ryan would leave on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, or Tuesday evening at the latest, Emily would find herself at Jason's door, or he at hers, and the affair that she had told herself, that very first February night, was a one-time mistake, had become instead the defining rhythm of her marriage's 4th year, a second, secret marriage that existed entirely inside the calendar gaps of the first one. Ryan Mitchell was not, by any reasonable measure, an unobservant man. He closed 6-figure equipment deals by reading the small tells on a hospital procurement director's face, the tiny hesitations that told him whether a number was negotiable or final. He noticed things for a living, but there is a particular blindness that comes from trusting someone completely, a blindness that has nothing to do with intelligence or attentiveness and everything to do with the simple architecture of love. You do not go looking for evidence of betrayal in a person you have built your entire adult life around, because the looking itself would feel like its own kind of betrayal. And so Ryan, for nearly 2 years, saw a marriage that looked, from every angle he thought to examine it, exactly as solid as it had always been. There were signs, in retrospect. There are always signs, in retrospect, that particular curse of hindsight that makes the obvious feel unbearable once you finally understand what you were looking at. Emily had started, sometime in that 2nd year, taking noticeably better care of herself on the days he traveled, a new workout routine she'd mention almost defensively, as though anticipating a question he never thought to ask. She'd started keeping her phone with her at all times, even in the bathroom, even charging on her nightstand instead of the kitchen counter where it had always lived before. She was, some evenings when he called from a hotel room in Columbus or Cleveland or wherever the week had taken him, slightly distracted in a way he chalked up to a long day, a bad night's sleep, the ordinary friction of being a person with a life of her own. "You feel far away sometimes when I call," he told her once, on a call from a Marriott in Nashville. More observation than accusation. "I'm just tired, Ryan. It's not easy running this whole house by myself a week out of every month," Emily said, and there was an edge in it that surprised him slightly, and that he absorbed the way you absorb most small frictions in a long marriage, as simply part of the texture of two people's lives rubbing against each other. Nothing more sinister than ordinary fatigue and the accumulated resentment of an uneven division of domestic labor. He apologized, in fact, more than once during that period for traveling so much, for leaving her to manage everything alone. Apologies Emily received with a complicated mixture of guilt and something closer to relief, because his apologizing let her redirect the conversation away from anything specific, let his own decency become, unknowingly, one of the mechanisms that kept her secrets safe. Ryan Mitchell was, in the cruelest possible irony of his marriage, a genuinely attentive and self-critical husband, and that very quality, his willingness to blame himself first, to assume the distance he felt in his wife was his own fault for traveling too much, became one of the reasons it took him nearly 2 years to see what was actually happening 11 steps from his own back door. His friend and co-worker Chris Delgado noticed something first, or at least said something first, on a work trip to Columbus, roughly 8 months before that final Monday morning departure. The two of them were having beers after a long day of client meetings, and Chris, 3 drinks in and never one to hold back, said, "You ever get the feeling your wife's got a whole life going on that you're not part of?" "What's that supposed to mean?" Ryan said, more amused than alarmed. "Nothing, man, forget it. Deb's cousin's going through a divorce. It's just got me thinking about this stuff." Chris waved it off, changed the subject to the Panthers' upcoming season, and Ryan let it go, filed it away as nothing more than a friend's projection from an unrelated family drama, a comment that meant nothing at the time, and would come back to him, much later, with a weight it hadn't carried in that Columbus hotel bar. Megan Carter had never fully trusted Jason Brooks, a fact she'd kept mostly to herself, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, even to her own husband, something in the particular ease of his friendliness that struck her, on the handful of occasions she'd met him at Emily and Ryan's, as slightly too calibrated, slightly too good at making everyone in a conversation feel like the most interesting person in the room. She mentioned it once to Emily, early on, in the vague, deniable way you mention a feeling you can't back up with facts. "He's a good neighbor," Emily had said, a little too quickly, at a family barbecue 18 months before the affair came to light. "You're reading into things." "Maybe," Megan said, and let it go, because there was nothing to hold on to, no actual evidence, just an instinct she couldn't justify and didn't want to be the sister who manufactured drama out of nothing. But over the following year, small things accumulated in Megan's peripheral vision the way they hadn't in Ryan's. The advantage, perhaps, of being a sister rather than a husband, of having a relationship with Emily built on a different, older kind of attention. Megan noticed that Emily had started declining invitations to things during Ryan's travel weeks, claiming exhaustion or design deadlines, in a pattern that felt, to Megan, less like coincidence and more like scheduling. She noticed that Emily's texts during those weeks had a different rhythm to them, shorter, more distracted, sometimes with hours-long gaps that didn't match the pattern of a woman supposedly home alone with nothing but a garbage disposal and Netflix for company. She brought it up directly only once, over lunch in the spring, roughly 4 months before everything came apart. "Is everything okay with you and Ryan?" she asked, watching her sister's face carefully. "Why would you ask that?" Emily said, and there it was again, the too quick defensiveness, the particular tightness around her eyes that Megan had learned over 31 years as this woman's sister to recognize as the specific look Emily got when she was protecting something. "No reason. You just seem like you're somewhere else a lot lately." "I'm fine, Megan. Marriage is hard sometimes. Ryan travels a lot. It's not some big mystery." Emily's tone closed the subject with a finality that made clear further questions would not be welcome, and Megan, like Ryan, like Chris, like everyone who had a fragment of the truth without the full picture. Let it go, because suspicion without evidence is a fragile, awkward thing to act on, especially against a sister you love and a marriage you have no actual proof is in trouble. What none of them knew, not Megan, not Chris, not Ryan himself, was that Emily herself had, by that spring, begun to hate what she was doing with an intensity that frightened her, that she lay awake some nights next to her sleeping husband, turning over every possible way to end it, and that she kept not ending it anyway, because the pattern had become, by then, less a series of choices and more a kind of gravity, a rhythm her marriage's absences had trained her into so thoroughly that breaking it felt, in some genuinely confused corner of her mind, like breaking something structural rather than simply doing the right thing. By the time of that Monday morning departure for Columbus, the one that opens this story, the 11-minute packing job, the Uber in the pre-dawn dark, Emily and Jason's arrangement had been running for nearly 2 years with an almost administrative regularity that, looked at from the outside, would have struck most people as more disturbing than a single passionate affair might have been. This was not a love affair conducted in stolen, desperate moments. It had become a routine, nearly a schedule, one Emily kept as carefully in her head as she kept her design client appointments, organized entirely around the calendar of her husband's absences. She had, if she was honest with the version of herself that only came out at 3 in the morning on the night's guilt outpaced exhaustion, stopped feeling much of anything resembling passion for Jason somewhere in the second year. The affair had calcified, by then, into something closer to habit, a groove worn so deep into the shape of her weeks that she sometimes found herself walking toward his back door on a Monday afternoon without any clear memory of deciding to, the way you find yourself driving a familiar commute without remembering the individual turns. This was, in its own way, a more damning fact than any single moment of romantic weakness would have been, though Emily rarely let herself sit with that thought for long. A single mistake could be explained by circumstance, by a uniquely bad night, by the particular vulnerability of a particular unguarded moment. What Emily had built, instead, was infrastructure, a second relationship running in parallel to her marriage with a consistency that required constant, ongoing choice, week after week, month after month, for nearly 2 years, every one of Ryan's business trips absorbed into a rhythm that had nothing accidental left in it at all. Jason, for his part, had settled into the arrangement with the easy comfort of a man who had found something that worked for him and saw no particular reason to examine it further. He was not, whatever Emily sometimes tried to tell herself in her more self-forgiving moments, a man secretly plotting to break up her marriage and claim her for himself. He liked the arrangement precisely because it was contained, because Emily always went home before Ryan's flight landed, because there were no real-world entanglements beyond a shared back fence and an understanding neither of them examined too closely. When Emily, on 2 or 3 occasions over those 2 years, raised the subject of ending it, always in the aftermath, always in the specific clarity that came right after, before the loneliness of the next empty afternoon set back in, Jason never argued, never pushed, simply said something easy and understanding like, "Whatever you need, Em, no pressure," which had the paradoxical effect of making it easier for her to come back rather than harder, because there was no fight to have, no guilt he was actively generating, just an open door that made walking back through it feel almost weightless. That Monday, the one that opens this story, followed the pattern exactly. Ryan's Uber pulled away at 5:40. Emily made coffee, answered 2 client emails, and at 11:15 walked the 11 steps across the side yard to Jason's back door, entirely unaware that this particular Monday, for reasons that had nothing to do with any change in her own careful habits, and everything to do with a cancelled connecting flight in Charlotte that would put her husband back on the ground 11 hours earlier than either of them expected, was going to be the one that finally, catastrophically, ended it all. The trouble started in the Columbus airport at 2:15 that Monday afternoon, a maintenance issue on the connecting flight to Cleveland that the gate agent announced with the flat, practiced apology of someone who delivers bad travel news for a living, mechanical delay, no estimated repair time. All connecting passengers should expect significant disruption. Ryan spent 45 minutes in a rebooking line before accepting the only viable alternative. His Cleveland dinner meeting would have to happen by phone instead, and rather than waste a full day in a Columbus hotel room waiting for a Wednesday flight home, he could catch a nearly empty evening flight straight back to Charlotte and simply drive up for a rescheduled in-person meeting the following month. He texted Emily from the gate. "Cleveland's a bust. Flight got cancelled. Coming home tonight instead. Landing around 8. Surprise." Asterisk, he added a small laughing emoji, thinking of it as nothing more than an unexpected gift of an extra evening together, already looking forward to walking through his own front door 24 hours earlier than either of them had planned. Emily did not see the text for nearly 3 hours. Her phone sat on Jason's kitchen counter, face down and silenced, the way it always did during these afternoons, a small habitual precaution that had for nearly 2 years worked exactly as intended. When she finally picked it up at 5:40, dressing to leave, she always left by 6, in time to have dinner started before any hypothetical early return. A margin of safety she had built into the routine without ever once needing it until now. She saw Ryan's text sitting there, sent 3 hours earlier, and felt something cold drop through the center of her chest as she did the math. An 8 o'clock landing meant he could be home by 9, possibly earlier if traffic from the airport was light, and it was already 5:40. "I have to go," she told Jason, already pulling her shirt back on, her voice tight in a way it had never been during any of their previous partings. "Ryan's flight got cancelled. He's coming home tonight instead of Wednesday." "Tonight? Like when?" "Landing at 8. I don't know exactly when he'll be home. Could be 9, could be earlier." Emily was already moving toward the door, running through the list in her head. She needed to be back in her own house, showered, dinner started, the ordinary evidence of an ordinary Monday evening in place before her husband walked through the door 24 hours ahead of schedule. She made it home by 5:50, showered by 6:15, had chicken thawing and a pot of water coming to boil by 6:30, moving through her kitchen with the specific, efficient panic of a woman erasing a day, and if Ryan's flight had landed on time, if the drive from Charlotte Douglas had taken the usual 25 minutes, if any of the dozen small variables that make up an ordinary evening had gone exactly the way they usually did, Emily might have pulled it off, might have bought herself another indefinite stretch of the life she'd built inside the gaps of her marriage. But Ryan's flight landed 19 minutes early, and there was no line at the rental car counter. He'd driven to the airport that morning and left his car in long-term parking, so there was no rental car counter at all, just a short walk to his own vehicle, and Charlotte's evening traffic was, for once, mercifully light. And at 7:40, 20 minutes before Emily had allowed herself to expect him, Ryan Mitchell pulled into his own driveway, tired and pleased with the small unexpected gift of an evening home early, having absolutely no idea that he was about to walk into the end of his marriage. Emily heard the garage door before she was ready for it, still 10 minutes from having dinner in any presentable state, her hair still slightly damp, and she felt her whole body go tight with the specific adrenaline of a plan collapsing in real time. She met Ryan at the kitchen door with a smile that felt, even to her, visibly effortful, and a kiss that he received without apparent suspicion, tired and happy simply to be home. "Surprise," he said, setting his bag down by the door in its usual spot, an unconscious mirror of the ritual that had begun this whole day. "Sorry, I know it's chaos. Dinner's probably not close to ready. It's fine. I wasn't expecting you till Wednesday." "Obviously," Emily said, too brightly, moving back toward the stove, grateful for an excuse to turn her face away from him. They ate a slightly late, slightly overcooked dinner, and Ryan talked about the cancelled connection and the rebooking chaos, and Emily listened and nodded and asked the right questions in the right places, performing a normalcy that felt, from the inside, like holding her breath underwater. It was working. By 8:30, dishes done, the two of them settling onto the couch for the kind of unplanned, easy evening together that Ryan found himself genuinely grateful for, Emily had begun to believe she might actually get through this unscathed. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter at 8:40, face up, where she had left it in her rush to get dinner started. A small, catastrophic oversight in an otherwise carefully managed evening. "Ryan." Closer to the counter, glanced over out of nothing more than idle habit as the screen lit up, and saw, before he had time to look away, before some better instinct could stop him, a text from a name saved simply as Jason that read, "You left in such a hurry, forgot this on my nightstand. Want me to bring it over, or should I just hold on to it till next time?" With a photo attached, small and thumbnail-sized on the lock screen but unmistakable all the same, a single gold hoop earring that Ryan recognized immediately because he'd given Emily that exact pair for their 7th anniversary. He didn't say anything at first. He simply sat very still on the couch, staring at his own hands, running the sentence back through his mind 3, 4, 5 times, trying to construct any version of it that didn't mean what it very clearly meant, and finding, with each pass, that there was no such version, that left in such a hurry and forgot this on my nightstand, and a photograph of his wife's earring sent from their next-door neighbor's phone at 8:40 on a Monday night, admitted of exactly one interpretation, and it was the worst one available. "Emily," he said, and something in his voice made her turn from where she was rinsing a glass at the sink, and she saw immediately, with the specific sick-drop clarity of a person watching a slow-motion collision they can no longer stop, that he had seen the phone. "Ryan, I can explain. Whose earring is on Jason's nightstand?" Ryan said, very quietly, and Emily, standing at her own kitchen sink with soap still on her hands, understood that the 2 years of careful architecture she had built to keep her marriage and her secret life running in separate, non-intersecting rooms had just, in the space of a single mistimed text message, come down entirely at once. What followed was not a single explosive argument but something worse, a slow, methodical unspooling that lasted the better part of 2 hours, Ryan asking questions in a flat, controlled voice that frightened Emily more than shouting would have, because it was so clearly costing him everything he had to keep it that steady, and Emily answering them, one by one, with a honesty that came less from courage than from the simple exhaustion of 2 years spent lying, a relief, even in the middle of catastrophe, at finally not having to manage the story anymore. "How long?" Ryan asked, standing now, arms crossed, unable to sit still. "Almost 2 years. 2 years." He said the number like it was a foreign object in his mouth. "Every trip, was it? How many times, Emily? I need you to actually tell me." "I don't have an exact number," Emily said, and then, seeing his face, understood that vagueness was its own kind of cruelty in this moment, and forced herself to be more precise. "Most of your trips, not literally every single one, but most of them, almost all of them, the last year." Ryan sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, and Emily watched something happen to his face that she would remember for the rest of her life, not the rage she'd braced for, not even primarily grief, but a kind of dawning, horrified recalculation, as though he were rapidly rerunning every business trip of the last 2 years through a new and devastating filter. "Columbus in March," he said, half to himself. "Nashville in June. The week I was in Atlanta for the conference, you sent me that whole nice text about missing me." "I did miss you," Emily said, and it came out smaller and more pathetic than she meant it to. An attempt at honesty that landed, in that room, as something closer to insult. "You missed me while you were sleeping with our neighbor," Ryan said, and for the first time his flat control cracked, his voice rising sharply enough that Emily flinched. 11 steps, Emily. He lives 11 steps from our back door. I helped him rebuild his deck. I had beers with the guy who was screwing my wife every single time I left town to do a job that pays for this house, this kitchen, that stove you were cooking dinner on to cover for it." "I know," Emily said, crying now, not trying to defend herself anymore, because there was nothing left to defend. "I know exactly how bad it is, Ryan. I've known for 2 years. I tried to stop it more than once, and I kept going back, and I don't have some excuse that makes any of it okay. I was so lonely, and I made a choice, and then I made it again and again, until I don't even know anymore how to explain why I kept doing it, except that at some point it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like something I couldn't figure out how to climb back out of." "That's not an excuse. That's not even close to an excuse." Ryan stood up again, moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back. 2 years, Emily. I trusted you completely for 2 years while you built an entire secret life 11 feet from where I sleep. I can't be in this house right now." He grabbed his keys off the counter, the same counter where the phone still sat, screen dark now, and walked out into the night, leaving Emily alone in a kitchen that, 20 minutes earlier, had held the last ordinary evening of her marriage. Ryan spent that first night and the 3 weeks that followed in Chris Delgado's guest room, a space usually reserved for Chris's mother-in-law's occasional visits. Decorated in a floral wallpaper, Ryan found himself staring at for long stretches in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, his mind cycling relentlessly through 2 years of business trips, now recontextualized into something almost unbearable to think about. "I said something to you," Chris reminded him, on the second night, the two of them at the kitchen table well past midnight, with the rest of the house asleep. "Columbus, a while back. I said something about your wife having a whole life you weren't part of. I didn't know anything specific, man. I want to be clear about that. It was just a stupid comment because of Deb's cousin." "I remember," Ryan said. "I brushed it off. You had no reason not to." "That's not on you." Chris refilled both their glasses, though neither of them was drinking with much enthusiasm. "You trusted your wife. That's not a character flaw, Ryan. That's just what marriage is supposed to look like." Ryan didn't fully believe him, not in those first raw weeks. He moved through a familiar, brutal sequence, the disbelief that came first, replaying every trip, every phone call, every "I missed you" text, now filed under suspect. The anger that came next, so total some nights that he'd find himself standing in Chris's kitchen at 3 in the morning with his hands shaking, unsure what to do with the force of it. And beneath both of those, quieter and more persistent, a grief that had nothing dramatic about it at all, just a low constant ache for the specific, ordinary life he'd believed he had, the 11-minute packing ritual, the driveway kiss, the whole architecture of trust that had made his marriage feel, right up until that Monday night, like the one part of his life he never had to manage or second guess. He didn't go back to the house for those 3 weeks, communicating with Emily only through short, necessary logistics, whose turn it was to be there for the cleaning service, a piece of mail that needed forwarding. The mechanics of two people beginning, without either of them saying the word yet, to unwind a shared life. He told his parents on the second week, a call that was almost as hard as the confrontation itself had been, his mother going quiet on the other end of the line in a way that told him she was crying, his father, a plain-spoken man not given to much emotional expression, saying only, "You did nothing wrong here, son. I want you to hear that clearly. Nothing you did caused this." Ryan appreciated the sentiment and did not, for a long time, fully believe it. There is a particular species of self-doubt that comes with discovering infidelity that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the sheer disorientation of the betrayal, a nagging, irrational voice that wonders whether he'd traveled too much, been too absent, failed in some way he couldn't quite name to be the husband who would have made his wife's loneliness bearable enough that she never needed Jason Brooks's back door at all. It took him months, well past those first 3 weeks at Chris's, to fully separate the fact of Emily's choices from any imagined failure of his own. To understand, the way his father had tried to tell him from the very first week that a decision made freely and repeatedly by another adult was not a referendum on his own worth, however thoroughly the betrayal had convinced him otherwise in the small hours of the night. Megan Carter drove the 4 hours from Raleigh the weekend after Ryan moved out, finding her sister in a version of herself Megan had never seen before, hollowed out, moving through the empty house in Ryan's absence like a woman surveying wreckage, the specific silence of a house built for 2 people now occupied by only one. "I knew something was wrong," Megan said, sitting across from Emily at the kitchen table, not unkindly but not gently either. "I asked you, more than once. You told me I was reading into things. I know. Was it always Jason this whole time?" Emily nodded, unable to look at her sister directly. "Almost 2 years, every time Ryan traveled basically." "I don't, Megan. I don't have a good explanation. I've been trying to find one for 3 weeks, and I can't. I was lonely, and it started small, and then it just kept happening, because stopping felt harder than continuing, and I know how insane that sounds. I know it doesn't excuse anything. It doesn't," Megan said, flat and honest, because she loved her sister and had decided, driving down that morning, that honesty was the only useful thing she had left to offer. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this is understandable, because I don't think it is. Ryan didn't do anything wrong. He worked hard, he came home, he loved you as far as I could ever tell. You didn't have some terrible marriage that justified this. You had a husband who traveled for work and a neighbor who was available, and you made a choice about that over and over for 2 years, and I think you need to actually sit with that instead of looking for a story that makes it feel like something that happened to you instead of something you did. Emily cried, harder than she had in front of anyone since that first Monday night, and Megan, despite everything she'd just said, put her arms around her sister anyway, because the two things, the honest accounting of what Emily had done and the fact that she was still Megan's sister and still deserved comfort in her grief, were not. Megan had decided somewhere on the drive down, mutually exclusive. What do I do now? Emily asked, once the crying had subsided into something quieter. I don't know if he's going to want to try to fix this, Megan said carefully. I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that he won't, and that if he doesn't, it's not because he's being unreasonable. 2 years is a long time, Em. It's not one mistake he'd maybe find a way to work through. It's a pattern. Patterns are harder to forgive than moments. Emily understood, sitting in her empty kitchen with her sister's hand on her back, that Megan was right, and that some part of her had known it since that Monday night, watching Ryan's face do its slow, horrified recalculation across every business trip of the last 2 years. She had built something that could not simply be apologized back into place. She had built, without ever quite admitting it to herself while she was building it, a second marriage that ran in perfect parallel to her first one, and there was no version of an apology, however sincere, that could unbuild 2 years of Mondays. Ryan made the decision to file for divorce 5 weeks after that Monday night, sitting across from Chris at the same kitchen table where he'd spent so many sleepless hours, having spent those 5 weeks turning the question over from every possible angle, talking to a therapist Chris's wife had recommended, talking to his parents, talking to himself in the specific relentless way people talk to themselves at 4 in the morning when sleep won't come. He had considered, seriously, whether the marriage could be salvaged. He was not, by nature, a man who gave up easily on things he'd built, and there was a part of him, the part that still remembered 9 years of a genuinely happy marriage, the 11-minute packing ritual, the driveway kisses, the woman who had laughed at his jokes and built a life with him he'd believed in completely, that wanted, at least in theory, to explore whether trust could be rebuilt from something this thoroughly broken. But every time he tried to imagine the practical shape of that reconciliation, he ran into the same wall. He would have to go back to a house 11 steps from Jason Brooks's back door. He would have to travel for work again. His job required it. There was no version of his career that didn't, and every single time he left, for the rest of his marriage, some part of him would wonder, would have to actively fight down the wondering whether the pattern of the last 2 years was really over or simply paused. He did not believe he had it in him to live inside that particular kind of vigilance indefinitely, checking his own wife's behavior the way you'd monitor a wound for infection, and he did not believe, if he was honest with himself, that a marriage sustained by that kind of vigilance was a marriage worth sustaining at all. I think I'm done, he told Chris, the words landing heavier in the room than he expected, even though he'd been circling toward them for weeks. I keep trying to find the version where we work through this, and every time I get there I just picture myself packing for a trip in 6 months and wondering the whole flight whether it's happening again. I don't want to live like that. I don't think I even could, honestly, even if I wanted to. That's not you giving up, Chris said. That's you being honest about what you can actually survive. There's a difference. Ryan called Emily the next morning, the first real conversation they'd had since that Monday night, and told her, as gently as the situation allowed, that he'd decided to move forward with a divorce. Emily, who had spent 5 weeks bracing for exactly this call, while some smaller, more hopeful part of her had kept imagining a different one, cried on the phone but did not argue, did not beg him to reconsider, because some honest part of her recognized, the same way Megan had helped her recognize it weeks earlier, that she had forfeited any real standing to ask him to stay. I understand, she said finally. I'm sorry, Ryan. I know that doesn't fix anything. I'm still sorry. I know you are, Ryan said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it. that his fury had, over 5 weeks, settled into something quieter and sadder, a grief for the marriage he'd believed he had, rather than the specific rage of the discovery itself. "I'll call a lawyer this week. We should try to keep this as clean as we can. There's no reason to make it uglier than it already is." Paul Whitaker, the attorney Chris recommended, was a calm, methodical man in his 50s who had handled enough divorces to have developed a genuinely useful bedside manner, and he laid out the realities for Ryan in their first meeting with the same unsentimental clarity Chris had warned him to expect. "North Carolina is an equitable distribution state," Whitaker explained, sliding a folder across his desk. "That means the court divides marital property in a way it considers fair, which in most cases lands somewhere close to an even split, particularly in a marriage of your length with no significant separate property complications. Infidelity, on its own, generally doesn't swing property division dramatically. North Carolina courts have moved away from treating fault as the central factor in dividing assets the way they might have decades ago." "She had a 2-year affair with our next-door neighbor," Ryan said, still catching an edge of disbelief in his own voice every time he had to say it plainly to someone new. "That doesn't factor in at all. It can factor into alimony. In certain circumstances, North Carolina does still allow marital misconduct to affect spousal support determinations, which is actually somewhat more favorable to you than some other states. If we can establish the affair as illicit sexual behavior under the statute, and depending on the specifics of both your incomes, it could strengthen a position against Emily receiving alimony, or even support a claim for alimony from you, in theory, though given the income disparity between you two, that's less likely to be the relevant lever here. But the house, the retirement accounts, the joint savings, the court's going to look at those as products of a 9-year marriage, regardless of what happened in its final 2 years." Ryan absorbed this with the same grim, resigned frustration he was becoming used to, the specific unfairness of a legal system that could not, it seemed, translate the precise scale of what had been done to him into the language of asset division, however clearly it might factor into a conversation about support payments. Karen O'Shea, Emily's attorney, made largely the arguments Whitaker had predicted, that the marital home and accumulated savings represented 9 years of joint contribution, that Emily's part-time design income and the flexibility it had given the household deserved recognition, that the divorce should be resolved without turning the property settlement into a referendum on which spouse had behaved worse. The negotiations took 4 months, shorter than many divorces, but still long enough to feel, to Ryan, like an extended exercise in reliving the worst night of his life in increasingly bureaucratic detail. In the end, the settlement split close to evenly, the house sold, proceeds divided after the mortgage was paid, retirement accounts split according to a standard formula, the joint savings divided the same way. Ryan's attorney did successfully negotiate a modest, time-limited spousal support arrangement running the other direction, a small monthly payment from Emily to Ryan for 18 months, reflecting both the income disparity in Ryan's favor being less relevant than expected once his relocation costs were factored in, and, more pointedly, an acknowledgement written into the settlement language of marital misconduct that Emily's attorney, after some resistance, ultimately advised her client to accept rather than risk a contested hearing that would put the full 2-year pattern on the public record. There were no children to divide custody of, a fact that made the proceedings faster and, in its own way, sadder. Nothing left connecting the two of them once the paperwork was final. No shared calendar of pickups and drop-offs to force them into ongoing contact. Nothing but a signed decree and the quiet, permanent end of 9 years. Neither of them had expected to end this way. Jason Brooks's role in the story might have ended cleanly from a legal standpoint. The moment Ryan walked into that kitchen and saw a photograph of an earring on his phone, Jason was never a party to the divorce, had no stake in the property settlement, existed in the legal proceedings only as a name mentioned in passing in the discussion of marital misconduct. But Charlotte is a smaller world than it feels like from inside a marriage, and Jason Brooks did not get to simply disappear from the story the way a more distant affair partner might have. He still lived 11 steps away. That fact, absurd and inescapable, became its own slow-burning humiliation for Emily in the months after Ryan moved out. Every time she pulled into her own driveway, she pulled in beside the house of the man whose name had ended her marriage. and the easy, uncomplicated friendliness that had once defined their arrangement curdled, in the aftermath, into something neither of them seemed to know how to navigate. Jason had not, it turned out, been particularly interested in what came after discovery. He'd built his part of the arrangement around its containment, its lack of real-world consequence, and once that containment broke, once the affair became a documented fact in a divorce proceeding, rather than a private secret between two consenting adults, his interest in Emily cooled with a speed that told her, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly how much of what they'd had together had ever really been about her specifically, rather than about the easy, convenient shape of the arrangement itself. They spoke twice after that Monday night, once, awkwardly, in the driveway, Jason offering a stiff, insufficient apology that Emily received with a kind of numb disbelief at how small he suddenly seemed, how little of the warmth she remembered from 2 years of stolen afternoons survived contact with actual consequence. And once more, several months later, when Jason mentioned, with visible discomfort, that he'd accepted a contracting job in Raleigh and would likely be selling the house within the year, Emily did not ask him to stay in touch. He did not offer. He sold the house in the spring, 9 months after that Monday night, and Emily stood at her own kitchen window one afternoon and watched a moving truck pull away from the house next door with a complicated grief she hadn't expected. Not grief for Jason specifically, whom she had by then mostly stopped thinking about with anything resembling longing, but grief for the sheer waste of it all, the recognition that she had traded 9 years of a genuinely good marriage for 2 years of an arrangement that had in the end meant so little to the other person involved in it that he could simply pack a truck and drive away from the wreckage without a backward glance. She would think, in the years that followed, about a conversation she'd had with a therapist she finally started seeing regularly after the divorce was finalized, a therapist who helped her understand, slowly and without excusing any of it, that the affair had never really been about Jason at all, had been instead about a loneliness she'd never learned to name or address directly, a loneliness that predated Ryan's travel schedule and had simply found, in his absences, a convenient shape to attach itself to. It was not, the therapist was careful to clarify, an explanation that made what she'd done acceptable. It was simply an explanation, the kind that let Emily eventually stop asking herself the unanswerable question of how she could have done this to a man who'd never given her any real reason to, and start instead doing the much harder, much slower work of understanding herself well enough to make sure it never happened again. Ryan Mitchell moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in South End the month after the divorce was finalized. A deliberate choice, close enough to downtown that he no longer needed a long commute, but far enough from the old neighborhood that he wouldn't have to drive past his old street on the way to the grocery store, wouldn't have to make the small daily calculation of avoiding a house that no longer belonged to him and a driveway that no longer had his car in it. He kept traveling for work. There was no version of his career that didn't require it, and in the year after the divorce he found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, taking a strange comfort in his old 11-minute packing ritual, the one habit from his old life that had survived completely intact, unspoiled, because it had never really been about Emily at all. It had simply been about efficiency, about a man who liked systems, and Ryan discovered, folding shirts in his new apartment before a trip to Nashville 8 months after the divorce, that he could still find a small, private satisfaction in doing a familiar thing well, even after everything else around it had changed. What did change, gradually, was the specific anxiety that had come to define his relationship with his own travel schedule in that first year, the low, persistent yum of a mind that couldn't help but calculate, on every flight out, what might be happening back home, a habit that had nothing to do with his current single life and everything to do with 2 years of conditioning he hadn't asked for and couldn't simply switch off the moment the marriage ended. His therapist, the same one Chris's wife had recommended in those first raw weeks, helped him understand that this was a normal, even predictable response to the specific shape of his betrayal. That a man whose marriage had been undone by his own travel schedule would, understandably, carry some version of that association into whatever came next, and that healing from it would take time, rather than willpower alone. He dated cautiously in the second year, nothing serious at first, a handful of dinners that mostly reminded him how thoroughly the last 2 years had reorganized his sense of what trust was supposed to feel like from the inside. It took him the better part of 18 months before he could sit across from someone new without some part of his mind running a background calculation about what she might be doing on the nights he wasn't around. An unfair, exhausting habit of mind that he worked deliberately and with real effort to unlearn, because he did not want to spend the rest of his life punishing every future partner for a betrayal that hadn't been theirs. Chris and his family remained his closest anchor through all of it, Sunday dinners at their house becoming a fixed point in Ryan's week the way his marriage once had been. And somewhere in the second year, Ryan realized, with a kind of quiet gratitude he hadn't expected, that he had rebuilt something that felt genuinely solid around him. Not a replacement for what he'd lost, but its own separate sturdy thing, built slowly and honestly rather than assumed the way his marriage's foundation had turned out in retrospect to have been. He thought about Emily less often than he expected to as the months accumulated into years, not because the betrayal had stopped mattering, but because the specific, obsessive quality of that first year's grief had gradually worn down into something more like an old scar, present but no longer actively painful, effect of his history rather than a wound he was still actively tending. He heard, through the small persistent grapevine of people who'd known them both, that she had moved to a smaller condo across town, that she was seeing a therapist regularly, that she had not, as far as anyone knew, dated anyone seriously in the 2 years since the divorce. He felt, hearing this, less satisfaction than he might have expected in the rawest months of his anger, and more a kind of distant, complicated sympathy, the recognition that whatever Emily had broken, she had also, in some sense, broken it in herself as much as she'd broken it in him. 3 years after that Monday night, Ryan Mitchell stood in his South End apartment, packing for a trip to Denver, the 11-minute ritual as automatic as ever, and found himself, for the first time in a long while, thinking back through the whole arc of what had happened without the accompanying flinch that used to come standard with the memory, the diagnosis of it, if you could call it that. Feeling for once like history rather than an open wound. He had, in that third year, started seeing someone new with an intention he hadn't felt ready for in the 2 years prior. A woman named Alicia he'd met through a mutual friend, a physical therapist with her own history of a marriage that had ended badly, though for entirely different reasons than his own. And there was something in the specific, unhurried way they'd built trust with each other over 8 careful months that felt, to Ryan, like proof that the capacity for it hadn't been permanently damaged after all. Only bruised, only in need of more careful handling than he'd once assumed came standard with any relationship. "You still do the packing thing," Alicia said one evening, watching him fold shirts with the same brisk efficiency he'd once demonstrated for Emily in another bedroom, in another life. 11 minutes, right? Chris told me about the 11 minutes. Chris talks too much, Ryan said, but he was smiling. Yeah, 11 minutes. Some things don't change. Does it bother you? Traveling, I mean, after everything. Ryan considered the question honestly before answering, the way he'd learned to consider most things honestly in 3 years of therapy and hard-won self-examination. It used to. For a long time, actually, I used to lie awake in hotel rooms doing this whole anxious calculation about what might be happening at home, even after there was no home left to worry about, just old wiring that hadn't caught up with reality yet. It's better now. I think, he paused, weighing the thought as he said it, testing whether it was actually true before committing to it out loud. I think I finally understand that what happened wasn't really about traveling. Plenty of people travel for work and stay married. It was about the specific choices Emily made, over and over, that had nothing inevitable about them. I couldn't see that clearly for a long time. I can see it now. He thought, sometimes, about the version of his life where that Columbus to Cleveland connection hadn't gotten cancelled, where he'd flown home on schedule Wednesday night instead of Monday. Dinner with Emily proceeding exactly as she'd planned it, the secret intact for however many more months or years it might have taken to unravel some other way. or never unravel at all. He didn't spend much time in that hypothetical anymore, understanding, with the clarity that 3 years of distance had given him, that the actual problem had never been the discovery. The actual problem had been 2 years of choices made behind his back, choices that would have kept happening, month after month, trip after trip, whether or not a mechanical delay in a Columbus airport had ever exposed them. The cancelled flight hadn't broken his marriage, it had only shown him finally that it was already broken, had been broken for a long time before he ever knew to look. What he held onto, standing in his apartment 3 years later with a suitcase zipped and ready by the door, was something quieter than anger and steadier than grief, a hard-won, unglamorous kind of peace, built slowly out of therapy sessions and Sunday dinners with Chris's family and 8 careful months with a woman who had never once given him reason to run the anxious calculations his old marriage had trained into him. He had lost 9 years of a life he'd believed in completely. He had also, in the 3 years since, built something new that felt, for the first time since that Monday night, entirely his own, sturdier, he thought, for having been built with open eyes by a man who now understood, in a way he hadn't before, exactly what trust cost and exactly what it was worth once you'd rebuilt it from scratch. He picked up his suitcase, checked his phone for the boarding pass, and walked out his own front door into a Tuesday morning that held, for once, nothing to fear in it at all. There was one more person who had seen something, earlier than almost anyone, though it would be more than a year before Ryan learned about it and understood what it might have meant if he'd known sooner. Nora Chen had been Ryan's assistant for 4 years, a sharp, unflappable woman in her late 20s who managed his travel calendar with a precision that meant she knew, better than almost anyone besides Ryan and Emily themselves, exactly when he was gone and exactly how long each trip lasted. She noticed the pattern almost by accident, roughly a year before the Columbus trip that ended everything, a small, nagging observation she made to herself one afternoon while reconciling Ryan's expense reports against his calendar, cross-referencing hotel check-in times with flight confirmations for an unrelated audit the finance department had requested. She wasn't looking for anything. She simply had, by virtue of her job, an unusually complete picture of exactly when Ryan Mitchell was and was not in Charlotte, and at some point that autumn, making idle conversation with Emily at the company holiday party. She'd mentioned in passing that Ryan traveled, 1 week a month? Pretty consistent schedule, huh? And watched something flicker across Emily's face, brief, almost imperceptible, the specific tightness of a person who has just heard someone name a fact they didn't realize was visible from the outside. Nora didn't think much of the moment at the time, filed it away the way you file away 100 small, unremarkable social observations in the course of an ordinary evening, and it wasn't until much later, after Ryan came back from that fateful Columbus trip and the whole office slowly learned, through the particular grapevine that exists in any workplace, what had actually happened in his marriage, that she found herself thinking back to that holiday party conversation with a chill of retrospective understanding. She never mentioned it to Ryan directly. It felt, even in hindsight, like too small and too speculative a thing to have acted on, a flicker of an expression at a party, nothing anyone could have reasonably built a warning out of. But she thought about it anyway, in the months after, turning over the specific unfairness of how much evidence had apparently been sitting in plain sight, distributed in small unconnected fragments across a dozen people who each had only enough of the picture to feel a vague unease and not enough to actually see the whole shape of what was happening. She did mention it to Ryan, eventually, almost 18 months later, over a work lunch after he'd relocated to the South End apartment and settled into something like his new normal. She told him about the holiday party, about the flicker on Emily's face, apologized in advance for not having said anything sooner. "You didn't have anything to say," Ryan told her, and meant it. "A weird look at a Christmas party isn't evidence of anything. I had 2 years of daily proximity to her, and I didn't see it. I don't think there's any universe where you clocking one expression was supposed to save my marriage, Nora. I still think about it sometimes," Nora admitted. "Whether I should have said something. Would it have changed anything if you had? Really?" Ryan considered his own question honestly. "I don't think I would have believed you. I think I would have needed exactly what actually happened. The text, the earring, undeniable, and right in front of me, because anything smaller than that I probably would have explained away. That's just what trust does. It's not stupid, exactly. It's just built to resist small evidence, because if it didn't, nobody could ever actually trust anyone. In the years that followed, Ryan found himself returning, every so often, to a question that had bothered him from the very first weeks after that Monday night and had never fully resolved itself even 3 years later. Not whether Emily's betrayal had been wrong, which was never in doubt, but what exactly. It meant that so many people around them had sensed something was off, and none of them, including Emily herself in her honest moments, had been able to stop it before it consumed 2 years of a 9-year marriage. He came to understand it, eventually, not as a failure of any single person's vigilance, but as a portrait of how ordinary, undramatic self-deception actually operates, not through grand, deliberate villainy, but through 1,000 small permissions people grant themselves and each other, an accumulation of averted eyes and unasked questions and reasonable-sounding excuses that, individually, never rise to the level of an actionable red flag, and that, collectively over enough time, build the scaffolding for exactly the kind of quiet, sustained betrayal that had happened 11 steps from his own back door. Chris still lived in Charlotte, still had Ryan over most Sundays, and their friendship, forged in the specific fire of those first 3 raw weeks, had deepened into something Ryan valued as much as almost anything else that had survived the wreckage of his old life. Megan and Ryan had, somewhat unexpectedly, remained in occasional touch as well. Not close, not regularly, but enough that Ryan received second-hand, small updates about Emily's life that he received now with a settled, distant equanimity rather than any active hunger for the information. Emily, for her part, had built a smaller, more careful life in the 3 years since the divorce. The therapy Megan had gently pushed her toward continuing well past the initial crisis, a slow rebuilding of her sense of herself that had less to do with any new relationship and more to do with the harder, more private work of understanding why she had done what she'd done clearly enough that she trusted herself not to do it again. She thought about Ryan more than she let herself admit to anyone, including her therapist, in the early months, and less as the years accumulated, the specific ache of what she'd destroyed settling, the way Ryan's own grief had settled, into something more like a permanent, quiet feature of her history than an open wound demanding daily attention. Neither of them ever spoke again after the divorce was finalized, not out of ongoing bitterness, so much as the simple fact that there was nothing left connecting them once the paperwork cleared. No children, no shared property, no reason for their paths to cross in a city the size of Charlotte beyond the occasional accidental sighting at a grocery store or a restaurant. Moments that had, in the first year, sent Ryan's heart racing with something between anger and grief, and that had, by the 3rd year, become almost unremarkable. 2 people who had once built an entire life together, now simply strangers occupying the same city, polite and distant, exactly the phrase Emily herself might once have used, in another context entirely, to describe the very thing she had once been so afraid of becoming. There was, in the end, no dramatic final scene between them, no last conversation that tied the story into something resembling closure, only the slow, undramatic fact of 2 lives that had once been fully intertwined gradually finishing the process of coming apart, thread by thread, until there was nothing left holding them together at all except the shared, unspoken knowledge of exactly what had happened and exactly why it couldn't be undone. Ryan carried that knowledge forward into a new life built more carefully than the old one. Emily carried it forward into a quieter, more searching version of her own, and Charlotte went on being Charlotte around both of them, a city large enough to let 2 people who had once shared a mortgage and a marriage bed disappear from each other's daily lives almost entirely, and small enough that neither of them ever quite forgot the other was still out there somewhere, living a life that had once, for 9 years, been meant to be lived together.